Here's what I would suggest as an approach. I'm feeling very excited that the two leading Christologists of our day, James Dunn and McGrath, are being called Unitarians now, and they are indeed. James Dunn says Jesus is not Yahweh. He's not the God of Israel. Quote from his latest book. Jesus is not Yahweh. He's not the God of Israel. McGrath says the same thing, that in the Bible there is no Trinity. Now he goes on to say the Trinity is fine, that's another issue. But in the Bible it's not there. And all of our Unitarian friends, some of whom died for what we're saying today, were imprisoned until they died, had acts of parliament enacted against them, John Biddle, burned at the stake, Servetus, burned by Calvin. We're not talking small stuff here. We're talking life and death. So back in Colossians, where people love to go, they forget that Paul is difficult in some of his writings. Peter said that, our beloved brother Paul, whom the unstable and the illiterate, the people who aren't learned enough, twist to their own destruction. That sounds to me like cyanide in your coffee. You twist the scriptures, you're killing yourself to your own destruction. So you never begin with Paul. You start with Matthew and Luke. Then you have about 5 chapters in all describing the origin of Jesus. You take that in fully before you start messing with one preposition in Colossians 1. But here's what happens in Colossians 1. And this is not so hard. Colossians 1:15. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Well, Adam was the image of God. That means the visible image of the invisible God. Of course, that means he's human. Not angel, not God. The image of God is not God. That's silly. No, he's the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. Now, the word firstborn, prototokos, doesn't necessarily mean you're the first one chronologically to be born. You're the preeminent one. There are lots of cases where the firstborn is not the first child to be born. It can be. So this word prototokos, firstborn, means that he's the preeminent of all creation. And he is indeed. He's the preeminent one. It doesn't tell you when his origin was. That's told you exhaustively and exhaustingly in Matthew and Luke. So when your friends say, well, what about Colossians 1? You say, wait a minute. Let's be sure we're not going to contradict Matthew and Luke and the rest of the Bible before we do one preposition. He's the firstborn, the preeminent one in the whole of God's creation. Always was, in the plan, and continuously will be. Now he explains it, that word har in verse 16. This is the unpacking. Let me tell you what I mean now. Paul says in verse 16, in him, not by him all things were created. That's false. Our best Greek experts, for instance, in the expositor's Greek New Testament, he says flat out, this does not mean by him. That's a fraud. The Greek word there is en, which is a very flexible preposition. Within the sphere of, broadly, within the sphere of him, Jesus, all things were created. Now, one of our very top Greek experts, Nigel Turner, whom we were privileged to know many years back, was very struck by the fact that in the tenses of the verb here, that's the time of the verb, there are 2 different tenses suddenly interchanged. One is that were created. In him, not by, in him all things were created, both in the heavens and the earth, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers. We're not talking about what is it, the bees, you know. How does that go?
Birds and the bees.
But we're not talking about the birds and the bees. We're talking about the creation of authority here. That's the topic. They were all created in him, not by him. Then he goes on to say, all things have been created through Jesus. A sudden switch of verb tense, which is very striking, and a switch to a different preposition, through him. So the sense is this, in him. Now what about in? What does it mean? It doesn't mean by. That would make Jesus then contradict, or Paul would then contradict Isaiah 44:24, which is a key text. God created everything by himself, nobody was with me. I was alone at creation. If you don't get your stake dug in there, you're open to all sorts of misinterpretations. In him, What about the N? Well, our top Greek authorities, the famous trilogy Moulton, Milligan and Turner, Nigel Turner, says the N here should be read in a causal sense. Because of him, of course. In him, because of him. James Dunn gets that right now and says the meaning is with him in intention. There you got it. With him in intention, all things were created. That's called a divine passive. Were created by God. Were created by God. Divine passive. In him, with him in mind, with him in intention, James Dunn, the top Christologist of our day, with him in intention, all things were created by God. That's the original creation. And now, let's add something else. All these authorities have been created, stand created through Jesus. That's the present creation. A difference of tense. The one is the distant, distant past when God did all the work by himself. And the second one, through Jesus, would be the present creation. And Jesus is indeed the co-creator in the present, not the past, but the present creation. So there's a significant change of verb tense there. From an aorist, if you want the technical term, the aorist tense were created, to the perfect tense, which in Greek always means something that happened but is with ongoing present results. So something like this in English: all things stand created through Jesus. That's us in the new creation.
Quote from
Yes.
N.T. Wright.
Good. Excellent. What do you got
Colossians 1:16. Paul actually says, "In him," and though the word "en" can mean by as well as "in," it is better to retain the literal translation than
Yes.
to paraphrase as NIV has done.
Yep.
Not only is there an intended parallel with verse 19,
Mhm.
which would otherwise be lost, the passive "were created" indicates in a typically Jewish fashion the activity of God the Father working in the Son. To say "by" here and at the end of verse 16 could imply not that Christ is the Father's agent, but that he was alone responsible for creation.
Yeah,
Which would be a
which would
problem
be even worse. You
for
say Christ was
Trinitarians.
alone, right there.
Yeah, I mean, because
Yep. So we've got
pushes
Bishop
the
Wright
Father
there
out
supporting us there more or less.
completely.
I like a typically Jewish fashion.
Yeah,
What's that?
typically Jewish way of thinking.
That there's only one individual.
Yes,
Doing-
everybody knew that, right. Anyway, that preposition there is most important. In him, with him in intention, all things were created. And then all things now stand created through. The through word there is typical of what Jesus is doing now. God is working through him as an agent here. If God is working through him before Jesus was born, that would be more what they call an instrumental activity. If you're working through your wisdom or you're working with Jesus in mind, that is, so to speak, an instrument. It's not yet a personal thing. But through the new creation, that would be an agent, a literal agent. Now, those terms are sometimes varied, in the conversation, but that would be one distinction that might be possible. In him, with him in intention, all things were created, and all things now stand created through Messiah in the new creation. And he's before all things. Now, that doesn't have to mean he was chronologically alive before everything. The word before is either superior in rank or before in time. It has an ambiguity. Of course, you can guess which the translators go for. He is before all things, he is above all things, is fine, superior to all things, and in him all things hold together. That's interesting. In him. Is that what it reads there? In him all things hold together. That's the present creation there. The lesson to be learned from all of this is you don't argue major points from prepositions by themselves. You start with Matthew and Luke and the rest of the Bible, and once you're going to turn Jesus into a pre-existing person, you've lost the fact that he's really a human being. He's also head of the church. Then he goes on in 18, he's head of the body of the church. And he's the beginning and the firstborn, the preeminent one from the dead. Of course he is. They're literally the first to be resurrected from the dead. All of that's clear.
Is it true that by equal?
Well, if you want to say something done completely clearly by, ipo means by.
In relation to creation,
Yes.
it's never.
No, the creation never said by. It said be ipo. No. That's a good point.
Isn't this one of those occasions when that saying, without context, it's all pretext.
That's good.
Yeah.
Without context, it's all pretext. If you're going to tackle Colossians 1 without the context of the entire Bible, especially the 5 chapters in Matthew and Luke, which go to great lengths to tell you about the origin of Jesus, so you can stop some of the conversation short by saying, wait a minute, can you argue these prepositions here? Are you sure you want to contradict Matthew and Luke? Now we have the help of Daniel Kirk, who recently got in trouble with the authorities for writing a book about Matthew, Mark and Luke, where he says that in Matthew, Mark and Luke there's no incarnation with a capital I. There's no pre-existence. We did a webinar with him too. So he's supporting us entirely. If you are going to say that this implies a literal pre-existence, you're contradicting Matthew, Mark and Luke. That has destroyed Scripture for us.
Is it true also that the verb create and
it's cognates.
is used only of God?
Ktizo, God did the creating. I'm not sure. I've looked that up. Maybe.
That's what this scholar says. The
Okay.
verb create and its cognates
Yes.
are used in the NT only of God's creation.
Yes, good point.
The noun may be used of the act of creating
Mm-hmm.
or of the thing created.
Yes. Okay, that's probably useful. Certainly we know Jesus is involved in the new creation. We know that wisdom was created in the old, but that's not what he was saying. They talk about the new. Yeah, Jesus doesn't go around creating stuff. Much less did he ever say that he made them male and female. God did, right? That's quite clear. Anyway, that piles on a lot of detail.
Okay, we're getting some audio
Well, we're about
outages.
to finish.
We're about
I
finished.
think we're finished.
We do appreciate your patience with all of that. That gets us through the 2nd chapter of Hebrews. We've introduced the high priest idea. Much more of that coming. Death is the penalty of sin. Shedding of blood is death. Without the shedding of blood, no sins can be remitted, because God is a God who demands that sin is punished by death. Well, we do that even with our legal system. Some sins are punished by death. If you're the God of the universe, you're the judge of everything, and you determine that in your system, sin results in death. Therefore, somebody has to shed his blood. Well, all those animals did, you see, as a type in the Old Testament, as a pattern, as a forerunning, as a foreshadowing. And the ultimate death then was the sacrificial, atoning, shedding of blood by Jesus himself. I think that's where we're working, in that direction we're working in this book. Okay, we're going to close then, right now.